guys, I just want to cover today the idea that the issue we're bringing up, the presuppositional issue we're bringing up is that the foundation of the new Bibles is, in effect, science, falsely so called, and being spoiled through philosophy. And what we mean by that is when you look at the foundation of the new Bibles, that they're founded on science of textual criticism and paleography, the papyrology, these sciences that developed in the 17 to 1800s, and they basically analyze handwriting, or at least paleography is analyzing handwriting styles to try to establish a date, of when it was likely to have been written, and they compare, the style of handwriting from other things that they may know that has a date on it or some way to verify the date. But basically it reduces to varying degrees of probability and has built-in assumptions. And I wanted to read a section out of this book here regarding what's an underlying assumption in the manuscript dating when it comes to paleography. Phil Davies here in this section, page 40, he says, "Without the theory of scribal schools, the discipline of paleography, of course, is impossible. So we need to conclude that the controlled evolution of writing styles is due to the existence of some official schooling that guaranteed consistency." So in other words, there had to be, in order to have this concept of dating with paleography, the built-in assumption is that there was some established standards that would have required some type of schooling to maintain a uniform, basically generational uniformity in handwriting style so that you can track subtle changes and whatnot. But he notes in the footnote down here at the bottom, footnote 10, he says, "However, it remains a possible flaw in paleographical analysis that schools may have developed slightly different writing traditions and their script may have evolved at different rates." So that's a built-in possible flaw into the paleographical assumptions. But also you have not just in establishing paleography and papyrology, but there are forgeries that have to be considered that would affect your probability quotient, to determine what's authentic and what's not. And there's one example of the archaic Mark manuscript that was considered to be a class 1 manuscript as far as authority, established by Kurt and Barbara Olland, and it was to take precedence above all other manuscripts, that classification. And it turned out, after they did analysis of the ink, that the inks contained chemicals that weren't available until the late 1800s, early 1900s, so it was a forgery. So, the scholarship can be deceived. They can be wrong. So that's something to consider when you're talking about how do they know what manuscripts date to what age, and what else is built into how they determine whatever the transcriptional probability, what the scribes were most likely to have copied versus the intrinsic probabilities, what the writer was most likely to have originally written. And they come up with, really the foundation is probabilities. And so there's some assumptions built in here already, the ones we just read, but also the presuppositional assumptions are that logic and science and math and these things would have to exist independent of the God of Scripture, because there'd be no way to extract these presuppositional necessities from a text if you are using them to establish the text. In other words, you can't get the truth of the text if you don't have the text. What we see going on is, as the paleography and papyrology and these disciplines developed about the late 1800s and into the 1800s, they were trying to establish a new text. They wanted to get rid of the Textus Receptus because they thought it was all corrupted and it was late, and they didn't accept that scholars and laymen had almost in their mind like a superstitious adherence to the Textus Receptus, that it was a received text, the text of the Reformation, that they claimed they believed that it was final authority. So they wanted to get rid of that because it wasn't scientific, and Bart Ehrman covers in this particular book here, Misquoting Jesus, on page 116 and 117, he's talking about Karl Lachman, who was going to try to reproduce, for the first time in 300 years, a text that was not related to the TR. So it says that he was going to use Latin manuscripts and patristic quotations, and so he wasn't editing the TR. It said that, to quote him here, is that he was going to abandon the TR completely and establish the text anew on his own principles. And so this is really what textual critics are doing. They're trying to create their text from their dating methods, their dating methodologies, and that requires necessarily an assumption of logic and science and mathematics and sense perception and all the preconditions of intelligibility. It requires that they are independent of the God of the text, because you're trying to reconstruct the text. So he says in 1831 he produced a new version of the text not based on the TR, and this was the first time anyone had dared to do so, and it had taken more than 300 years, but finally the world was given an edition of the Greek New Testament that was based exclusively upon ancient evidence, and thereby these philosophy of logic and science and etc. independent of God. If you're establishing a text based on these principles, then these principles can't come from the Scripture. You're using them to establish the Scripture, so they become final authority. And so when you receive the new Bibles, you are basically saying that textual criticism, the science of textual criticism, is final authority. Textual critics are final authority, and it also requires, in order for you to assume that, as we already said, that it requires that you have logic, science, and math, sense perception, the preconditions of intelligibility. It requires that they are independent of the Scriptures, because you're using them to construct the text. But it also, what it does is when you're completed, it renders the Bible as subordinated to varying degrees of probability, and you can't derive infallible final authority from probabilities. So these are the problems that you face and you encounter when you follow the new Bibles. And so I know they do contain the preconditions, the doctrines that are necessary for the preconditions of intelligibility, and that's great. They have the essential Christian doctrines in these new Bibles, but the foundation of them, it's like a snare that you get trapped in, because you have to accept the principles upon which they're established if you're going to accept their validity and authority. So let me know what you think in the comments below, all right?